Hi. So, good morning, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the English Association of ARSD College, I am very glad to have everyone here for this session with Miss Sanam Khanna. A little bit about our guest speaker. Miss Sanam Khanna teaches English at the Department of English, Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. She has worked and published in the fields of EFL and assessment methods, as well as young adult fiction and European drama. Her areas of interest include cultural studies, literary theory, and popular fiction, especially science fiction and children's fiction. Ma'am has published numerous reviews and articles and has also co edited a bilingual collection of seminal writings through the ages from India titled Indian Literature and Introduction in 2005. Her recent works include writings on critical thought in academic writing and sports culture and YA fiction. We're very happy and glad to have you with us, ma'am, and we are sure it's going to be a great session here with us. Today, ma'am will be speaking on philosophy and science fiction, especially in connection to Ursula Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from the Omelas. With that, I would request Shibani ma'am to also introduce the ma'am and say a few words.
Good morning, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to Sanam, especially. We are extremely pleased to have you here, especially given the kind of nightmare you've just been through. Very, very glad to have you here. Happy that you're here safe and sound. A warm welcome to my colleagues, those who've joined from outside of our college, all my students, and again those who've joined out from outside of ARST College. I don't want to take much time, and sort of let's dive in right into the topic. Science fiction I haven't been able to read much of late because I think we all sort of somehow get restricted by what we are teaching or the work we are doing. But this is an area that absolutely fascinates me, and I just read the text that you are going to be talking about last evening, and I hope to read more of Le Guin because what I read was absolutely amazing. And I think during the pandemic, especially, I think there has been a resurgence of interest in science fiction, possibly because there is very little gap between what is seen as science fiction and reality. Maybe that gap is dwindling. And we've seen a lot of books coming out on science fiction. I think Sanam's coming out with something very soon from the little that I know. I think she has an essay in a forthcoming publication. Maybe Sanam, you could just mention that at some point. And so I'm looking forward to a very, very interesting session. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sanam, for being here.
Thank you, ARST, for having me here. It's a great pleasure. And yes, I'm very happy that we didn't have to reschedule the talk and I could be here safe and sound. So, should we
Uh,
start?
yes, ma'am. Ma'am, just a few housekeeping rules before we start. I would request everyone to keep their mics and their audios on mute so that we don't have any interference. As well as if you have any questions regarding the talk that we would, because we would be having a moderated Q&A session after ma'am finishes with her lecture. So you can keep all of those and write all of those in the chat box and we can come to them after ma'am finishes. Ma'am, we can start now, I think.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to discuss, as the title says, exploring utopia through Omelas. That's the story in the course. And I will also talk about Le Guin's fascination with the concept of utopia and how she twists and plays with that theme, with that concept in many of her works. So just to introduce, next slide, please. Ursula Le Guin is best known for her science fiction and fantasy, and she changed the genre in the sense that she brought in a far greater emphasis on the human situation, on character rather than setting, because if you look at the way SF or science fiction has evolved, the earlier forms of science fiction were more interested in technology, or what we call hard science, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute. But Ursula Le Guin is notable for bringing in concerns about what it means to be human, what does gender mean, of reviewing what we take for granted in society and doing it through her speculative fiction, through her science fiction, in ways that had not been done before. Next slide, please. So, just to clarify some of the key terms that I will be using, I'll be talking about philosophy and a sub-branch of that, which is ethics or morality. I will define science fiction and speculative fiction, and then discuss utopia, dystopia before I move on to the story proper. So next slide. When we talk about philosophy, we literally just mean love of wisdom. And philosophers through the ages have basically tried to question what is the meaning of life. And obviously and interestingly, certain principles of philosophy change over time, and certain principles continue to remain something that stand the test of time. And so despite all the changes over the millennia, we still try to talk about or still ask what is the meaning of life, what is good, what is evil, and certain fundamental questions which affect us not just on a metaphysical level, but on a physical level. Next. So philosophy is a way of thinking about certain subjects such as ethics, thought, existence, time, meaning, and value. And usually we say that philosophy involves the 4 R's: responsiveness, which is that you're responding to the environment, to the situation, to events that you see around you, to the human condition, that you reflect, reason, and that you are open to reevaluate whatever has been formulated. So really, in one sense, obviously, philosophy is a form of critical thinking. And you'll see how critical thinking is also important when you are world building in science fiction, because that too is a kind of responsive, reflective, reasoned re-evaluation of the world that you are living in. So what I'm trying to argue is that there is a very close connection between philosophy and science fiction. Next. One of the major branches in philosophy is ethics. And ethics is about what we ought to do and what is best to do. And therefore, ethicists also question not just what is good, but what is beautiful, because there's always seemed to be this relationship between goodness and beauty, or ugly and evil. And so ethics is really an investigation into what is good, what is proper, and therefore what is beautiful, and the converse as well. Next slide. So just to reiterate, it's the study of what is right or wrong in human conduct, and it therefore studies moral principles. And so often when we are talking strictly in terms of philosophy as an academic discipline, it's also known as moral philosophy. But as I'm going to explain to you, there is a difference between ethics and morality as we understand it. The next slide. Ethics is a branch that involves systematizing, defending, or recommending the concepts of right and wrong behavior. In other words, there has to be a basis, there has to be a logic. The 4 R's that I mentioned earlier have to be applied if ethics is to stand the test of a philosophical principle. Now, morality is slightly different because it's a body of standards or principles derived from a code of conduct. And that code of conduct can be of a particular community, philosophy, religion, or culture, or even personal beliefs. So in that sense, ethics, like I said, is kind of a critical reappraisal at all times of what you believe, but morality tends to be something that you acquire from those around you. Next slide. So just to continue, it's a branch of philosophy, ethics. What should I do? based on values, principles, purpose, rather than unthinking habits, social convention, or self-interest. Therefore, morality is often inherited. It's also usually, like I said, an unconscious acquirement. Next slide. So this kind of sums up the argument. I won't explain it. It's fairly evident. But the last point here is important. Ethics versus morality. Ethics will look at the survival of the society, whereas morality can be more about personal or familial survival. And this is precisely the principle you see functioning in a story like The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, because it's not asking what is good for the individual. It's also placing that larger question of what is good for society. Next. So the next term is science fiction. It's usually abbreviated as SF or sci-fi. And it's a form of fiction that deals principally with the impact of actual or imagined science upon society or individuals. You have a picture of Hugo Gernsback. It's important to know who he is because he's really influential in the history of sci-fi. He's the one that makes it a form, a popular genre. He used the term in 1920s, and by 1930s, mid-30s, it's a well-established genre of popular fiction. Next. Now, let's look at what, not just as a generic term, but as a critical term, what does science fiction mean? And the most famous and popular, well accepted in academic circles is the definition offered by Darko Suvin, who calls it the literature of cognitive estrangement. And therefore, what does that mean? Cognitive is really understanding, estrangement meaning a removal, a certain strangeness to what you are seeing. And for Darko Suvin, this comes through the novum. So in realistic fiction, for example, the world is as you know it. It may be set in the past, but it's a world that you kind of believe would have existed in the past. And it's not too difficult for you to imagine that world. Whereas the novum in science fiction is a world which is not immediately recognizable as your own, and you have to make a conscious effort to engage with it, which is why he differentiates it from myth and from the pastoral, which he thinks is a kind of idealistic SF, but not quite. So he discusses, in the essay that you have in your course, why SF should be taught, how should it be taught, and how it is a form of social imagination. And therefore, he discusses how in another essay, not the one in your course, how it evolves from utopian settings to include journeys, and therefore moving on to focus largely on social issues, which is what we see in this story. Next. Very briefly, the origins. Next slide. Yeah. You often hear of people talking about a religious text or a mythical story as having science fiction elements. Now, just to be pedantic about it, that's a way of reading. I mean, of course, that's a choice that you make of reading. But as a genre, as a historical genre, SF has its origins in the West and very specifically in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, where writers and intellectuals begin to think about the impact of science and technological changes brought about and popularized during the Industrial Revolution. They begin to question what would its impact be on mankind and future societies. So it has a specific historical point at which it arises. And if we look at other texts beyond or before that period, then it's a way of reading rather than a generic distinction. Next slide. Now, what happens is that when the genre starts, it's fairly rooted in science, technology, adventure, colonial enterprise. And so by the 60s, late 50s, you see that conventional SF is being criticized for being overly patriarchal, excluding women and minorities, ignoring diversity, and willfully appropriating other cultures. And the corrective measures came from writers such as Le Guin, Marion Zimmer Bradley, Joanna Russ, Roger Zelazny, Thomas Disch, amongst others, of course. But these are the most famous writers who began transforming the genre. Next, please. And therefore, when you read critical terms or when you read critical essays, you will hear people discuss hard SF versus soft SF. And hard SF and soft SF, really the difference is that soft SF is seen as more literary in nature, tends to be more concerned with the critique of social order and politics, not so focused on journeys, adventures, space travels, or the technology behind it. The emphasis is on the human. And it is at this point, moving from hard SF to soft SF, that the term SF itself begins to be associated not just as science fiction, but speculative fiction, which is the term that most popular writers writing in the genre today prefer to use. Next. So, if you look at the term speculative fiction, it's not that recent. In fact, Heinlein is the one who coined the term in 1947, and then the speech was printed in 1951. And he defines speculative fiction as a narrative concerned not so much with science and technology, but with human actions in response to the situation that technology creates. Therefore, it highlights a human rather than a technological problem. And this is an important shift in that sense in the history of science fiction. Next. Today, of course, speculative fiction tends to be an umbrella term, which has both SF, fantasy, horror, supernatural, superhero fiction, utopian, dystopian, apocalyptic fiction, and alternate histories. So it's now become an umbrella term, and you'll find that these, if you go into a bookshop, these are the genres that you'll find if you look at the shelf, which is called science fiction. And you may or may not agree with this kind of mixing together, but this is how the genre has evolved. So let's move on to the ones who walk away from Omelas. Next slide. Is part of her oeuvre. And the one thing that you have to understand is that Le Guin is fascinated with the concept of utopia. She returns to the concept in story after story. In fact, her fantasy sequel called the Orsinian Tales is also a kind of utopian creation. But in every story or novel where she creates a utopia, it's a questionable utopia. She even subtitles The Left Hand of Darkness as something that it's utopia, but is it really utopia? And that's, I think, an important point to understand that Le Guin pushes in her writing, is that we are, in one sense, limited by the limits, by the concepts that already exist in our world. Can we really imagine a utopia for everyone when our world does not really allow it? So this story is considered one of her most philosophical works. It's one of the most anthologized stories in the history of SF short stories. Next. So the next key term that I really like to look at is utopia. And the word is coined by Thomas More, and it's obvious, from the Greek, and he's really punning because utopia, means both good place and no place. Topia, of course, means place. So he puns on the sound as well as the spelling when he calls it Utopia, published in 1516. And it's one of the most read works. Almost all civil servants in the earlier examinations were expected to know it. And today we say that utopia refers to the detailed, concrete picture of a flawless community or to the systematic exposition of the underlying principles of such a community. Next. And therefore you have what is called utopian fiction, which is set in an idealized world. Now, the thing to understand is that the author of a utopian novel is creating a world which he or she considers perfect or utopian. Therefore, this does not mean that the work is free from conflict. Rather, it becomes a way of understanding at that time, at the time at which the work is written, what counts for utopia in that society. All right. And it's something that's very popular in science fiction. It's a form of extrapolative thinking. Utopia is either set in the future or on the past. But very obviously, it's about exploring real problems facing our world, the world of the writer, in whatever time the writer is writing, whatever the situation of the writer. And it is making political, philosophical, or moral points through the narrative of the story. Next, please. And therefore, related to utopia, arising a little later in literary history, is the term dystopia. From the ancient Greek, dys meaning bad or hard, and topia meaning place. Sometimes you'll find it in critical terms also being called cacotopia or anti-utopia. Simply a community which is undesirable or frightening, characterized by squalor, oppression, disease, overcrowding, environmental destruction, war. Basically, all the fears of mankind which are manifested in a dystopia. Continue. And dystopian fiction, very obviously, there's no dearth of them these days. Novels, films, comic books, graphic novels, video games contain the same narrative feature, that is, to depict a world which is undesirable. And the most common themes seem to be for wars, unending wars, social and economic class divides, poverty, environmental devastation, life under extreme forms of control, and ultimately, the greatest fear in dystopian fiction is the loss of individuality, the loss of diversity. Next. Now, before we enter Omelas, what I just want to make clear is that both utopia and dystopia, in critical terms, are not seen as being antithesis of each other. Darko Sovin says, how does utopia operate? He answers it by saying, an explicit or implicit comparison of its imagined community with the author's environment by example or demonstration. So basically, utopia is a demonstration of what could be perfect because there are imperfections in the society in which the writer is writing. But Tom Moylan develops a concept called the critical dystopia, where he says, critical dystopia burrow within the dystopian tradition, but in order to bring utopian and dystopian tendencies to bear on their expose of the present moment. So briefly, what I'm trying to say is that both utopia and dystopia are reflections upon the contemporary world of the author, and both are in one sense exposing, one by highlighting and the other by highlighting the opposite that could be, but both are critiques of the social environment which has produced that work. Next. So science fiction, the most famous texts of SF are in fact known for exploring philosophical ideas. Science fiction doesn't just illuminate philosophy. In fact, many critics say that the genre grew out of philosophy. The earliest works of SF, now again, as a way of reading, you can find it in philosophical texts, from Plato's allegory of the cave to his exploration of ideal statecraft in the Republic, to even somebody like the Scottish philosopher David Hume, which I think it's Deleuze who calls him an SF writer, because to illustrate his philosophical concepts, he creates alternate worlds. And that's really what SF is doing, creating alternative worlds as a way of reflecting on your present day world. So the concept of using allegorical or metaphorical thought to explore the problems of the present life are a way of thinking that you find both in philosophy and in SF. Next. Yeah. So when you begin reading the story, The World of Omelas, to most writers who are familiar with Le Guin, it's very familiar, the way the city is described. It's almost like the cities in Orsinian Tales or The Wizard of Earthsea, which is a trilogy I highly recommend. It's meant for children, but every time you read it, you see a different layer, different meanings emerge. So it's really the power of Le Guin's writing that makes a children's story something so very delicate and nuanced. Now, one of the features of Le Guin's work is that you don't have overt scientific or technological elements in the story. And I could, go on to why that happens, because Le Guin has written extensively on it, but I don't want to digress from the philosophical angle. So I will just say that this is a feature of her writing. And her most familiar terrains are worlds which are a twist upon the past. She usually sets them in something that looks like the past rather than the future. And yet the problems are, of course, very, very contemporary. Next. So as you begin begin reading the story, it's almost like I said at the beginning, it's like a fantasy story. And it's almost as if Le Guin is teasing you, asking you, what did you expect when you began reading the story? Remember that when the story is written, she's just about establishing herself as a writer and coming to be known for playing around with genres. So this beginning, which is almost like fantasy, and then she moves on and she almost playfully asks the reader, the unnamed narrator asks the reader, do you think they have trains? Do you think they have washing machines? And then, does it matter? So, this playing around with readerly expectations, it's almost as if she's expecting the reader to construct the world along with her. And this is important to remember, because in that construction, she's also going to make you, in that sense, responsible for the world of Omelas. How have you interpreted it? Continue. So there's this very famous line in Omelas. She says, the narrator says, there are no kings and there are no slaves. Now, this may be a reminder, a very subtle reminder, the way Le Guin writes, that in Thomas More's Utopia, the citizens were expected to, sit around, read, develop their talents, therefore live the life of the elite. But somebody had to do the work of cooking and cleaning and gardening. And if you look at this plate, which is an illustration, the lower half, you'll see that there are two citizens who are sitting and discussing ideas, but at the back is a slave who's watering the plants. So very subtle hint that so far, no utopia has been imagined which is totally free of class hierarchies. But she says, or the narrator says, in Omelas, there are no kings and slaves. And we'll just go on with that idea. Next. Now, this phrase is picked up by Edith Hahn Beer in her 1997 memoir, where she recounts her life in Nazi Germany. She's the wife of a Nazi officer, not Jewish herself, but appalled at what she had said, at what she had seen. And she says that the Nazi attempt to create an Aryan utopia was flawed because there were masters and slaves. So it's important to remember this idea that when people set out to create a utopia, there is almost always an erasure of at least some people within that society. So very clearly here, the imprisoned child, like the Jews in concentration camps, is necessary for the creation and maintenance of a perfect world, perfect for at least a few. Another more obvious hint at a Nazi past lies in Le Guin's use in the story. She talks about the banality of evil, which is very, very telling, because It occurs in Hannah Arendt's work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. This work, the book came out about 10 years before the story, and it was much discussed in literary circles. So it's pretty clear that Le Guin would have had knowledge of the phrase and its importance, so that when she puts it into her story, she does so with full awareness of its resonances. And like Arendt, both the story and Arendt's work are questioning what constitutes evil. Because, you know, when Eichmann was on trial, Eichmann was one of Hitler's um, logistical experts, to put it mildly. That's what he called himself. But basically, he was responsible for the transportation of Jews to concentration camps and their quote unquote disposal. And at his trial, he kept saying, I was just doing my job. I was just doing my duty. You could have asked me to transport cattle or people or wood, and I would have done it most efficiently. So that is what shocks Hannah Arendt, because she says, you know, he looks like an ordinary person. He has children, he has grandchildren, he is nice to people, he's sweet, he's soft-spoken, and yet what was he capable of? And the question for Arendt, which was important, was that he didn't consider himself evil. And that's precisely the question that Le Guin picks up. What is evil then? Next. So when in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, the narrator says, happiness is based on a just discrimination of what is necessary, what is neither necessary nor destructive, and what is destructive. This is one of the oldest definitions of happiness. So if the citizens of Omelas are happy, this is in that sense, the functioning definition of happiness in Omelas. And this is very consistent with the Aristotelian understanding of happiness as a certain activity of the rational soul. And you'll understand, of course, the word rational has its own resonances in the history of logic, in the history of philosophy, and of course, for the Enlightenment. So a certain activity of the rational soul in accordance with virtue. So to be good, to be proper, is to be happy, according to Aristotle and according to the definition offered in Omelas. Next. So the citizens seem to have made a rational choice, but the chilling nature of the rationality, just a minute, sorry. Sorry. Of what is destructive. So they've decided this is happy, this is rational, and this is not destructive. But we realize that their happiness is based on the suffering of a child, and importantly, that child is an innocent child. Next. The story reveals a philosophical and social paradox of Omelas, that the sophisticated, happy, advanced society has a barbaric core. And that at that core is a suffering child denied all aid, any kind of solace, the sacrificial figure, the scapegoat. And the scapegoat figure is something that Le Guin terms the psychomyth. She says these are surrealistic tales which shared with fantasy the quality of taking place outside any history, outside of time. And in other writings, she often talks about how almost all religions have at their core, have somewhere within their rituals, the idea of sacrifice as necessary to propitiate the gods. And so she finds this very interesting. And that's the idea that she's picking up in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Now, in her next slide, please, she talks extensively on how the story is in fact inspired by her reading of an essay called The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life by the philosopher and psychologist William James. In fact, the subtitle of the story is Variations on a Theme by William James. And of course, there are other explorations of this theme in literature, but this is the one that Le Guin chooses to acknowledge. So in the next slide, the way that the essay proceeds is that William James says, if the hypothesis offered to us were that millions would be kept happy on the simple condition that a certain lost soul should lead a life of lonely torment, what independent sort of emotion can it be which would make us immediately feel, even though an impulse arose within us to clutch at the happiness, how hideous a thing would be its enjoyment when deliberately accepted as the fruit of such a bargain. And this is the crux of the story, that there is a bargain, many are happy, one suffers. But Le Guin's understanding of happiness is very, very clear if you understand that William James says such a happiness would be hideous. So if you read the story and the essay together, then it's very clear where both William James and Le Guin stand on this idea of happiness. Next slide. So in the same essay, he talks about, the three basic questions about what is a moral life. The first is the psychological, the second is the metaphysical, the last is the causistic or the rational. And all of these, he says, are attenuated, are moderated by our social and cultural environment. So he seems to be arguing for a moral relativism. Next slide. And at the end of the essay, he talks about the two approaches to life. One is the easygoing mood, which does not want conflict and accepts society the way it is. The other is the strenuous mood that seeks to achieve ideals, even at the at the cost of great personal sacrifice. And Le Guin's story can really be read as an exposition of these two moods. Those who stay very clearly reflecting the easygoing mood, but the ones who walk away reflecting the strenuous mood. Next, please. And many people have argued that Le Guin's story is a perfect example of what's called the trolley problem, which is often used in psychological experiments, which is really, if, in fact, when you Google the ones who walk away from Omelas, sometimes it will lead you immediately to sites which talk about the trolley problem. Very briefly, the trolley problem is that a train is hurtling down a track. The track diverges into two paths. On one path is one person, and on the other path are a group, 10, 12, 100, whatever number you want. Now, the train has to proceed. It cannot stop. So where and how would you divert the train? And almost always people say, I would divert it to the path on which there's a single person rather than many people. But then the psychologists begin changing the question, saying, what if that one person is the person you love most, or the person who has done a lot of good for society, or if the people who are the many are all, let's say, criminals, and the single person is a doctor or somebody who's been very useful, or your child or your mother. So you can see how the answers put the person who's answering in a moral dilemma. And that's really what you see in one sense in the story as well. Next slide. So I'm presuming, of course, that everyone is familiar with the story, but if you're not, the perfect society is perfect, everyone is happy, but the story reveals that there is a single child kept in abominable misery. And since it's a very short story, so the fact that the narrator spends some time on the physical description of the child is important. The narrator says it's naked. Its buttocks and thighs are a mass of festered sores as it sits in its own excrement continually. And then we are told the child can remember sunlight. It can remember its mother's voice. So what happens is we realize the child is A, innocent, B, it knows a better world. C, it has been placed here and now no one, not even its own family members, can speak to it. So the important point is that the existence of the child is not a secret. In fact, every citizen in Omelas bears responsibility for it. because they're introduced to this child, they're told about it. And the narrative then tells us that the initial shock and sorrow that they feel fades away, they accept its suffering. And these are the words of the narrator. Their tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive the terrible justice of reality and to accept it. And therefore, we see the pragmatic mood, the acceptance of the suffering of one for the happiness of many. And that's how the story goes. Next slide. These are the terms: to exchange all the goodness and grace of every life in Omelas for that single small improvement, to throw away the happiness of thousands for the chance of the happiness of one. That would be to let guilt within the walls indeed. And therefore, we are told the citizens don't feel guilt. The terms are strict and absolute. There may not even be a kind word spoken to the child. The citizens accept this and continue with their lives. So Le Guin's story, next slide, presents us with the classic philosophical problem of individual responsibility against social responsibility. Put in different words, I could say it's about ethics versus morality. Much after Aristotle and closer to our times, this problem is still at the core of Enlightenment thought. And it's important to remember that almost everything that we consider modern really, in one sense, owes its origins to the Enlightenment period, and concepts such as human rights, individual liberty, good governance, public health, public welfare, or even democracy take shape in this period. And one of the most influential ideas is the idea of the greater good or public welfare. Next slide. The concept which is derived from Bentham's idea of utilitarianism. And in his works, Bentham is absolutely categorical that the maximum good for the maximum number of people achieved by any means is ultimately justifiable as greater good. It's a rational measured choice, for him, both ethical and moral. But this is the question that Le Guin throws at you. Is it ethical? Is it moral? Next. And if we understand where Le Guin is coming from, very obviously the ends justify the means had become one of the slogans of the Nazi period. And it's very clear that this sort of argument can lead to horrific results, crass majoritarianism being the most obvious. And in Bentham's own time, a thinker like a philosopher like Locke, in fact, argued that the individual is supreme and that no system which overrides the individual can be a good system, can be a morally justifiable system. And he brings in the concept of individual sovereignty, that the individual has sovereignty over their body, and that there is no government, no community which can, in one sense, violate the body and consider itself civilized. So this is where the concept of inalienable natural rights, which are bestowed on a human being just by virtue of being born human, not your class, not your positions, not your position or your possessions, but the fact that you're born a human gives you certain rights. And it is to these philosophers that we, kind of owe the idea of human rights. And what becomes clear in the writing of philosophers such as Locke is that the idea of suffering is important. Next. Because if you look at Cartesian thought, I think, therefore I am, the idea of humanity or to be human which emerges is that if you are able to think, if you are able to be rational, and virtue is seen as a concept related to rationality, it's a rational choice to be good, to be virtuous, then rationality is a defining feature of humanity. But if we are looking at a writer like Locke, we are going to look at questions of the human rights, even of, say, disabled individuals, people who are mentally different, then you have a different understanding of humanity, and that is the capacity to suffer. If you can feel pain, if you can suffer, or if you understand what is degradation, then you are in one sense human, and to bring those conditions upon you is therefore inhuman, ethically, morally incorrect. Next. And that's precisely the concept that you see in Le Guin's story. The child suffers, the child remembers when it did not suffer. The citizens of Omelas know that the child suffers and they choose to do, this is important, they choose to do nothing to lessen the suffering of the child. Next. And therefore, the questions which are implied in the story, so Le Guin is saying, yes, it's rational. The happiness of many depends on the suffering of one. But is it just? What is the individual responsibility and how can it be balanced against social and community responsibilities? The entire goal of the story in that sense is to force the reader to confront the question of choice and responsibility of good and evil, and therefore to force upon the reader a philosophical reflection of what it means to live in the world that they are living in. Next. So what's important here is that there is no one individual that is responsible for the suffering of the child. It's a collective. No one is being actively cruel to the child. And yet the fact that the child is left to fester in its own waste, that it is denied that which is available to other citizens of Omelas, that's where the injustice lies. And the fact that the citizens, the ones who cry and then accept it and move on, instinctively they knew they were wrong. They knew they are wrong. But morally, because their society accepts it, they accept it as well. Next. Now, of course, the twist in the story is in the title and at the end. It's the ones who walk away from Omelas. She could have called the story Omelas, the ones who stay in Omelas, the child in Omelas, but she chooses to make it the focus, and the focus is on those who walk away. And the narrator says, these people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omelas through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands. Each one goes alone. And I'll discuss a little later why this word alone here is important. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Next. They leave Omelas, they walk ahead into the darkness. So they walk into the unknown. They do not know what lies ahead. They do not come back. That's something that's important. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. So in one sense, she seems to be saying, is Omelas utopia or is it not? If everyone is happy, it's utopia. But if even one suffers, then it becomes a questionable utopia. It's not really a utopia. And the question really is being thrown back at the reader. How do you imagine utopia? I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist. She's talking about the place those who walk away go to. But they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. And that's how the story ends. Next slide. The conclusion then is forcing the reader to confront not just what it means to be happy, but what it means to be free. And in one sense, utopia is also the freedom to reject that utopia. It's about critiquing what you see and being able to speak about it. And if those citizens of Omelas cannot speak about it and they have to walk away, what does it say about the society they are living in? That's the implied question. Now, Peter Fitting says that the story can be read as part of the new utopian tradition. Next slide, please. Which he says emerged post the 1960s, and its origin lies in the popular culture's approval of the civil rights movement, women's movement, anti-Vietnam stand. If you look at it in the 1940s, these things would have been unimaginable, that there would be civil rights movements, that the Blacks would be able to argue for equality, women would be able to argue for equality, people would be able to reject the draft. So that what seemed impossible in the 1940s is not just possible, but rampant in the 1960s. And therefore, Fitting says this gives rise to the new tradition. And Omelas, next slide, Gabriel Bello, talks about a mythography, which forces the reader into looking deeper at their own world. So whether it's a critical utopia, a critical dystopia, the new dystopian tradition, the new utopian tradition, at the end of the day, what it is a critique of the society, an allegory for the present day, distilled to its simplest elements. That for us to be happy, someone else must suffer. That we live off distant, perhaps unheard pain, even in our mundane moments, for we are all connected. And Bello is talking in the, within the understanding and the context of globalization, of cheap labor, cheap fashion, your gadgets. Do you know how they are being produced? And if you know, what can you do about it? She says, we are all connected, and when one takes, another must give. What would it mean indeed to walk from such a system, to walk away from our own world? And we return in one sense to what Jameson says, the significant potentialities of SF as a form is precisely this capacity to provide something like an experimental variation on our own empirical universe. In other words, to move away from what Suvin calls the zero world and use cognitive estrangement to make us look at our own world anew. Next. So Le Guin has often been questioned for her ambiguous utopias. Her narratives valorize a deep personal response, and one which often ends in isolation rather than community. I spoke about how it's about the one who walk, the ones who walk away, and each one walks alone. And my own reading is that the answer lies in Guin's abiding interest in Taoism and Oriental philosophical thought. Next slide. She was interested in history and anthropology. She, in fact, translated the Tao Te Ching, in her own words. And so all her works engage deeply with political and social concerns. And this story very clearly exhibits her engagement with ideas of culture, civilization, community, social progress, and structures, and most importantly, with the idea of individual responsibility, all of which in one sense are both political as well as philosophical concerns. And there's this very famous quote from The Dispossessed, where she says, the duty of the individual is to accept no rule, to be the initiator of his own acts, to be responsible. Only if he does so will the society live and change and adapt and survive. We are not subjects of a state founded upon law. So this idea of the mutability of law, of, in one sense, morality is important to Le Guin. She says, we are members of a society formed upon revolution. Revolution is our obligation, our hope of evolution. In other words, if you keep accepting society as it is, it can never improve. So that both critique and revolution in that sense, social revolution, are important in order to bring about the idea of improvement. Next. So you see a very Taoist vision of the individual and the relation to the world. The Taoist sage refuses everyday violence, even if her society permits it or is built upon it. It is the rejection of even the moral use of violence and the rejection of the coercion of oppression of even a single human being. Next. And this is something that Jameson, writing about Le Guin, he often does that. He's spoken about many of his stories. Next slide. The liberal rather than radical position in Le Guin seems to be underscored by her predilection for quietistic heroes and her valorization, previous slide, of an anti-political, anti-activist stance. What makes her position more ambiguous is her work rejects the institutionalization of violence, rather than violence itself. So that finally, in one sense, for Le Guin, utopia is always a journey. It's always a seeking of something better. It can never actually be found. Next. Next slide. So that ultimately the story is about recognizing inequity, inequality, differences in class positions, and the inevitable suffering which exists in society, and acknowledging it and taking responsibility for it. Individual responsibility, choice, and ethics are of paramount importance for Le Guin. In fact, she often says, I write in order to make people exert choice. I write in order to make a difference. And sometimes you'll find that critics call her an ethical anarchist because she frequently critiques state power, capitalism, looks at alternative political economies. And to clarify, for Le Guin, an anarchist, and again, that's a philosophical position that she's taking, an anarchist is one who chooses and accepts the responsibility of choice. And next slide, which is where I'm ending. So she has this extremely philosophical understanding of individual responsibility, of what writing can do, of what individual stances can do. And she often points out that if we are to create better worlds, we have to be able to imagine the impossible, what is impossible in our own times. She says, we live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Again, reference is to Thomas More's Utopia. And that if the idea of equality then seemed very radical, now that we have at least a theoretical idea of equality, how do we put it into practice? So she says any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. So that for her, ultimately, writing is a deeply personal way of engaging with personal philosophies and social critiques. And that's where I'll end.
Thank you so much for that exhaustive overview, not just of Le Guin, but also of the genre of science fiction. And I think we have a few, more than few, I hope, fifth semester students too. So I think certain, because they are now beginning to do Sultana's Dream, which has been incorporated in the syllabus. So I think this is the conversation about what is science fiction, function of science fiction. I think that is an extremely useful sort of entry point into the study of science fiction. Yes, I think people can write in their questions in the chat box, and they can be taken up. In the meantime, Maitri, would you want to sort of start off by asking something if you have questions?
Hi, Sanam. Thank you so much for this wonderful, evocative talk. I mean, I love the emphasis put on, the philosophical underpinning of Le Guin's work. And, I mean, we picked this up in class, but obviously don't go into such detail. So I'm really glad that you, sort of created this genealogy from Aristotle to, I mean, actually more contemporary thinkers and, placed Le Guin's work within it. There's this very sort of disconnected sense that we have of whatever text that we're doing. So I think it's your method was so illuminating that it'll be wonderful for the students to follow. I was just wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about I mean, because you brought in so many intertexts, right, that actually appear in Le Guin's work, and the part of the debates that she was a part of, that she actually brought in. If you'd like to talk a little bit about what's seen as Dostoevsky's influence and the brothers Karamazov and the question of choice there. I mean, it's something that I discuss in class, but I thought maybe you'd like to just talk about it.
So, in Brother Karamazov, you have Alyosha and Ivan who are talking about the little child who suffers. And the conversation goes that perhaps such suffering is important. Now, what's significant is to remember that Le Guin said she was not aware, or she had not actually read the Brothers Karamazov at that point, which is why she doesn't acknowledge them, but bases her story and acknowledges only William James. At subsequent points when she was questioned, she actually said, like as I mentioned this before, that almost every religion builds upon the idea of the innocent sacrifice. Because this is, if you look at it, it's important. And I think it's illuminating that throughout history, we have the concept of the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is never that of the criminal. It's always someone who's innocent, something that's innocent, whether it's an animal or a human being. If you look at the Mayan sacrifices, so this is the idea that I think at an anthropological level, rather than a religious level, fascinates Le Guin. Though I know that at another point in an interview, she also said that in one sense, what's so radical about Christianity is that the sacrifice of Christ is the sacrifice that ends all sacrifices. Because if you look at it, the Old Testament is built upon the idea of ritualistic sacrifice. But when you look at the New Testament, the suffering of Christ has redeemed humanity forever in that sense. And the other thing that she's fascinated with is Buddhism, because there is no concept of sacrifice there. The only thing in Buddhism that you have control over, that you have a right over, is your own body. You cannot sacrifice someone else. You cannot subject any other sentient being to misery or suffering, because you simply don't have the right. Which is her link also to Taoism. This idea of individual responsibility, individual suffering, of rejecting the suffering of others to make your life easier, the propitiating of gods through sacrifices. So I think for her, it's a very anthropological angle that she's taking rather than just a literary one. And therefore more philosophical rather than literary. I hope that answers your question to some degree.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Maybe the students would like to pitch in. Now,
Yes.
Harsh, you had some questions about happiness, I think, in class. Maybe you'd like to ask ma'am that.
Who's the student? Shall I unmute that student?
Harsh.
Harsh.
Harsh is a co-host.
Harsh can
Yeah.
speak up, yeah.
Yeah.
Ma'am, he is unable to connect. I think he has some issue with his
Maybe he
internet.
could just type in his question or send it to one of you if he has a question, if he's having issues. I think he's been going in and out, I could see.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I'll just ask him.
Yeah. In the meantime, Sanam, not haven't read much, okay, but just general sort of question. Do you think because it's quite philosophical, this story, and I'm guessing a lot of her writing is, do you think the politics of science fiction, or how political sometimes science fiction can be, does it in any which way get diluted by the philosophical aspect of her writing?
I would say not, because in one sense, when I've discussed this story with my class, for example, we discussed fast fashion and how when you buy clothes from Zara or an H&M, you're buying them because they're reasonably priced, they're fashionable. But we also know that they're not meant to last for years. We also know that they are made by using almost slave labor, underpaid labor. When you're buying your iPhone, for example, the lithium is being mined in Africa and little children are used for it. So the question becomes, I think by putting it in this kind of anywhere, any place format, a more philosophical format, it makes it applicable to many more situations than if it were perhaps overtly targeting one kind of political problem or social problem. So you can read it as caste, you can read it as class, you can read it as labor. So that, and this is something that, she does very deliberately, I think, and because is that the power of philosophy? Because philosophy itself is often attacked for being apolitical. But if you read Le Guin's own interviews and writings, then for her, writing is an intensely political act. It's always political. Every word you choose, every situation you choose is political. And as far as she's concerned, there's never any getting away from politics. So I think that's a deliberate choice that she is making of having a wider applicability of her situation, so that, this story is one of the most translated stories in the history of SF. And I think that's a testament to the fact that different times and different societies can interpret it differently.
You're absolutely right. In fact, when I was reading the story, somehow I was thinking of, when you're thinking of this little boy who, and I was also thinking of, all the slums in our neighborhood, which we cross every day.
Correct?
So, and sort of, you don't even, it doesn't even register after a point. You're
Absolutely.
thinking about the refugee crisis all across the world, and how sort of, and also this current, I think maybe it's pandemic induced or whatever, this whole business of putting your happiness first. I think it gives a larger sort of perspective into that, your happiness first at what cost, what is the cost of your happiness.
That's interesting that you bring it up, because once when I was discussing this story with my class, one of the things we spoke about was this whole self-care industry that has sprung up. And that in one sense, what we're saying is, let's focus on ourselves. Let's not focus on anyone else. If you've survived, if you are happy, if you are comfortable, that's more than enough. You can pat yourself on the back.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the kind of social violence that would entail, what you're talking about. So what you normalize, and I think that is Le Guin's point. What violence have you normalized, institutionalized? What is your current state built on? If you can't do something about it, at least be aware of it, at least acknowledge it. I think that's why, in one sense, one of the critics says that Omelas is a utopia, because at least the citizens are aware of the suffering, unlike our own world where we don't even acknowledge that suffering. At some point in the story, she says theirs is not a careless happiness.
Yes.
So this idea of the careful happiness, so that it's a utopia because it's at least one step ahead of us. But obviously for Le Guin, the ones who are many steps ahead of us are the ones who walk away. And I think there was a question, let me just read this question that's come in about walking away. When some of the citizens of Omelas walk, is there a possibility that utopia is subjective, the place they're headed towards? Can their escape be another utopia? Okay, that's a good question. And like I said, I think what's important is, for Le Guin, is to acknowledge that A, there is violence. B, to make a choice. Will you accept that violence? Will you not accept that violence? And the fact that she calls the story The Ones Who Walk Away, for me, it makes it important that somebody is striving for something better even than this. This is great, everyone is happy, but one is not. Can you create a society where everyone is happy? Are you willing to take the risk of trying to create that society like the ones who are walking away? And it's very interesting because many years later, she wrote this story. It's called The Day Before the Revolution. And the subtitle is From the Ones Who Walked Away. So very clearly, the character in that story is one who walked away from Omelas when she was very young. They've created a sort of community, but the community is not perfect. A revolution is about to happen. She's aware of it. She knows that, the structure of this community that they have now established is going to be challenged, but she's fine with it. So I think that's Le Guin's point, that you have to keep striving for something better. If not this, then this. If not this, once you've established something, critique it and be willing to walk away from it in order to strive for something better. The day you sit back and say, okay, this is perfect, I'm okay with what is, I'm okay with somebody suffering, you've lost the chance to ever create a utopia. So utopia is always something better than what you have. But if you're not willing to critique what you have, you can't create something better.
Himakshi, are there more questions?
Ma'am, not as of now, but again, if somebody wants to ask their question directly, we can unmute them.
Yes, please. If anybody, maybe you could raise your hand or something if anybody wants to. Himakshi, if you could see if anybody is doing such, if anybody is keen, if
I think while we're waiting, Sanam, I think as a follow-up to Shivani's observation, I think when Joan Gordon is reviewing Dancing at the Edge of the World, and she says, "Oh, people are, more accepting of Le Guin because she's not as aggressive a feminist." And Le Guin says apparently at that point that I don't want to hurt any feelings, and Gordon appears to take that at face value, and she says that unlike other science fiction writers who are more confronting, Le Guin is somebody who is, and that's what even writers like Ambai, etc., right? That they're treading a middle path, or there's not enough confrontation, not enough provocation in their work. So that sort of, I think you've addressed this already, but I just found it interesting to sort of raise it again. The way we look at feminism, and some we label as more overt, and therefore perhaps I don't know if I'd want to put it qualitatively as better, but there's a perception that if you're more obvious about it, if you're more confronting, that is more acceptable than any kind of questioning of authority.
Yeah. Okay.
Anything maybe to say about that?
Okay. So I think there are two parts to how I would answer this question. One is to understand that when Le Guin starts writing, yes, SF is being criticized for being patriarchal, colonial, white, all of that. And she is pretty strident in her criticism. Her refusal to conform to the expectations of the genre. So since you've raised that question, I'll bring in the technology problem as well. She was furious when some critics said that there's, it's not technology, there's no technology in Le Guin. When her novels start or when her stories start, you're already in that new place, you're already on the planet, the spaceship doesn't matter, how you got there doesn't matter. And she said, yeah, you expect me not to know about technology because I'm a woman, but at the end of the day, if you can't make your own pencil or you can't stitch your own shoe, that's a kind of technology as well. Anything which you can't do is technology. Anything which is mystifying is technology. So I think what she's doing is bringing in new understandings of the genre, of terms such as gender, of technology. Because she does it in this very subtle way doesn't mean it's not in your face. I mean, if you look at the left hand of darkness and the very radical questioning of gender, but she does it as if it's a given. There's no antithesis to our world. It just is. There is no gender. People can change they change sex as and when the season is upon them. Now, that in one sense is so radical, but because she is not challenging a patriarchal code as it exists in a knowable form, doesn't mean that the novum she has created is not radical. So I think you have to kind of read where she's coming from and where she's going to kind of understand the nuances of how radical, nuanced writing can be without being in your face, without being overt, and that being, in one sense, also uh, perhaps a writing strategy to make herself more readable, to reach out to an audience. Because if you look at her speeches, if you look at her writings, there's no way she's not critiquing patriarchy, she's not critiquing states, she's not she's outspoken against capitalism, she's outspoken against surveillance. So I think both have to be brought together. And like I said, one has to understand that she's writing from a very deeply personal philosophy and ethos based on her understanding of the world, which is
Yeah,
perhaps
exactly. Yeah.
slightly metaphysical in one sense.
And also, I think in a non-Euclidean view, she talks about the porcupine, right? I mean, when she talks about sort of going backwards to go forward, she is declaring her agenda. I mean, she's being as overt as, I mean, as in your
Absolutely.
case as you want. But then there are different approaches also. I mean, not giving a structure power by, going up against it in a very direct way, but to actually reformat it completely and to shape it as given, right? I mean, why even?
Correct.
So I think it's a very, very, it's a radical approach in itself. So, I mean, yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for bringing that up. I think Ravi has a follow-up question for you.
Yes, ma'am. Ravi has a question. He asked, what about
Yeah,
misfits in a utopian world?
I read the
Yeah.
question. Yeah, so I think in one sense, what would you call those who walk away? Would you call them misfits? Would you call them ethical? Would you call them foolish or idealistic? I think the Le Guin leaves the field wide open. It's up to you what you want to call them. But I think she's fairly clear. They're not misfits. The fact that she gives that story this particular title uh, shows you very clearly where her sympathies lie. I mean, sometimes I'm asking class, what would she do? And I say she would walk away very clearly. So I don't think for her it's about being a misfit. It's about saying, if you're fitting in, why are you fitting in and what are you fitting into? That, go back to her idea of anarchy as consciousness, as responsibility, as choice. So yeah, your society might think you're a misfit because you aren't accepting the standards they have put out for you, the morality that they have put out for you. But for her, it's very important to evolve an individual ethos. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think Ravi won't be able to speak.
Yes,
Yeah, he says yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. And ma'am, I also got a question from Isha Dekari. She's unable to speak on
Sure,
or
sure.
write in the chat, so she just messaged me. She wanted to know more about what do you think using Le Guin's, not just the story in itself, but her ideology and philosophy about wanting to create a different kind of utopia from a dystopia. So she wanted you to elaborate on that idea.
Um, I think I know where she's, if I'm interpreting this question correctly, uh, you're saying also in one sense, and related to what Maitri was asking before, Le Guin doesn't spell out what is utopia. She doesn't spell out or create a location which is utopic and say, okay, this is it. This is where everything is perfect, and I'm done. I've created the perfect world. Uh, and like I said towards the end of my lecture, I think it's important to understand that for Le Guin, it's a process of evolution. It's a process of constant critique, of being open to critique, of being open to change, and of therefore striving for something better. If you're not doing that, if you're accepting status quo, then you are, in one sense, rejecting the capacity for evolution and change. Have I got all the parts of that question? Is there something I've missed?
Yes, ma'am.
Himakshi, there's a question by Harsh which he has typed. If you can read that as well.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, Harsh wanted to ask about, or actually wanted you to elaborate on the meaning of happiness as mentioned in Omelas, and especially with comparison to the imprisoned boy, and say the boy who's playing the flute and the people who are dancing around.
Yeah. I don't think I'm going to answer that question because that story is presenting to you, and the story needs to be read again and again. It's not, it's a deceptively simple story. If you try to uh, get past it in one reading, you're actually being unfair to it. So there are lots of little hints. You have music, you have dancing, you have a beautiful world, everything is green. Everyone is perfect, they're well dressed, they're well fed, except for that one child who has none of these. And I think that's the focus of Le Guin's story. Not what is happiness, not what counts as happiness. Those are easy questions. We all want music and dancing and to be well fed and well clothed and comfortable. But what about the one who does not have, and does not have this, not even the basics? And we are all aware, as Shivani said earlier, we are aware of the children in the slums. We are aware of the inequity around us. We know it's there. What do we do about it? And how is our happiness mediated by it? How is it mutated by it? Do we even allow ourselves to acknowledge it or not? So the question for Le Guin really is, what happens when this is denied? Even the least of these things. The child, what would happen if the child was given slightly more comfortable surroundings, music? What if people spoke kindly to it? I think that's really the telling part of the story. No one is allowed to say a kind word to it. So that the utter isolation of the child, the utter neglect that the child faces, is the counterweight to all the happiness of the citizens. Because it's telling you something about the nature of the citizen who accepts this bargain. So I think the happiness that is mentioned has to be weighed against the unhappiness which is not mentioned, silenced, erased. No one speaks for the child. Even the unnamed narrator doesn't tell you what the child is feeling. So you have to imagine it. And then you have to weigh them out and then apply it perhaps to your own society. So that there's a definition of happiness being offered, but at all times you have to be aware of what is not being offered, of the person, the one who is not being allowed to speak. Yes, please unmute yourself then.
Amal, let me just try and do that.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, the question I had was, like in this scenario that we were in the scenario in Omelas that we were talking about, in the end, a group of people start to walk away, and a group of and the rest still stay in the Omelas.
Wait, it's not a group of people. It's one person alone. Even if it becomes a group later, each one that goes alone. That's very important. That they have the courage of conviction, the personal ethos to walk away without looking for validation from others.
Ma'am, so I had this kind of a query, like the people who are still, the citizens who are still living in the Omelas, they understand that that a child is suffering, and because of the suffering they are happy. So it's kind of like they I guess we can say that they are kind of guilty about their happiness because they understand that their happiness has some sort of a suffering behind it.
No, the horrifying part of the story is that they feel no guilt. Remember, the narrator says that would be to allow guilt. If they allowed themselves to be nice to the child, if they allowed themselves to feel quote unquote pity for the child, that would be to allow guilt. they do not feel guilt. Yes, theirs is not an irresponsible happiness. They're aware that their happiness is made possible by this suffering, but they feel no guilt.
Ma'am, even if it's a responsible happiness, as you say, the people are experiencing a responsible happiness, and the one that walks away, don't you think it's kind of a use of that or use of the person's privilege? Like the person is not doing anything to kind of rectify the entire situation, rather than they're just giving it up and walking away.
Okay.
So what is your comment?
That's a question that very often comes up in reading the story. It's a question that's been addressed to Le Guin herself. And go back to the Jameson quote where I said that she has an anti-activist stand, though she was in her own capacity fairly active on political issues. In her stories, you could see this as an anti-activist stand, as somebody doesn't just walk up to the child and free the child or do something like that. Now, there's a reason for this. You can say that I personally reject the happiness that is due to me because of the suffering of this child. But I cannot take the decision to make others suffer, because it's a given that if I help the child, others will suffer. So I become responsible for the suffering of the others as well. Now, what the story seems to be, or seems to suggest, is that it's only when each one, and that's, in other writings, Le Guin says this, that revolution occurs when there are sufficiently large number of people who refuse to reject what is and seek something better. So what you have here is not a revolution. What you have is an individual saying, I will not make others suffer, but I will not accept the happiness that is obviously going to be mine if I let this child suffer. So that I will choose something which is uncertain, perhaps greater suffering, perhaps obviously less happiness than what I have here, but I'm okay with that. That's my choice. So this concept of ethical choice making is what Le Guin is trying to highlight.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there another question?
Yes, ma'am, it's in the chat box.
Ravi's question, I could trace an image of Omelas and Amishes, the immortals of Melua, a city established on ruins of other cities, which on the face of it looks perfect. To their misery, their main river is slowly dying due to their unethical actions. Does that mean that even the most perfect of utopias can falter in the long run?
Obviously. I mean, Le Guin's answer would be that once a utopia has been established for long enough, there is bound to be a certain stasis which occurs. And in that stasis, in that status quo, which becomes institutionalized, in Meluha, for example, you have, the deformed or the otherwise abled who are rejected. Shiva himself is an outsider. You have the reconciliation of the Suryavanshis and the Chandravanshis. So that at the end of the day, whether it's Amish or whether it's Omelas, what you are seeing is reconciliations of differences, reconciliation or attempted reconciliations of inequalities, of diversities, as being a prerequisite for creating a better world.
Another question from Runjun. In Omelas, we see there are no kings and priests, and in Sultana's Dream, the author talks about the power of women. So, does that mean Omelas had a hint of feminism?
There's nothing within the story to indicate that there is any kind of hierarchy within the citizens. But within the confines of the close reading of the text, I don't think there's an overtly feminist angle to this text, at least. unlike, say, Left Hand of Darkness or Wrath of Heaven, which are far more implicit in their critique of gender. I think gender is not the primary focus here. But yes, one possible reading of the story, as has been done, is to see the suffering of women, the unpaid labor of women in a society as being symbolic of the suffering of the child.
Now the questions are coming in. This is from Isha. But won't that suffering be more real than the happiness? The suffering caused by being kind to the child. In the story, there were children who came home crying and some didn't talk even. Does that not show their happiness by someone put down by their conscience? Does that not make the happiness bit unreal, and hence the whole point of utopia sort of crumbles?
Yes, the point of Utopia does crumble, but at least within the confines of the story and the close reading of the text. See, I think what we have to be very clear when we are reading as scholars is to see what is in the text and then understand what we are seeing beyond the text, between the text, outside of the text, and as interpretative strategies. So if I see this as a critique of capitalism or gender positions or class positions or caste positions, those are readings which I bring from my perspective to the text. All right. Within the confines of the text, we are told that they are happy. Yes, they may have been sad when they saw the child, but their tears dry up. That's why I highlighted that quote. At some point, they stay because they accept those terms. And that is their utopia. Just like in Thomas More's Utopia, it's utopia for the citizens of Utopia, but certainly not for the slaves who have to wait upon them. They don't have the same privileges or the rights, the leisure to read and plan and write, which for Thomas More was utopia. But you can see it's a very scholar's idea of utopia in one sense. I mean, I remember one of my students said in class, it's like all those IAS officers and their parties, and you have all the servants and the waiting staff, the drivers and all of them who are waiting upon them and making this very privileged life possible, where you don't have to worry about how you will get from point A to point B or who will pay for something. Things just happen because of who you are or what position you hold. That's Thomas More's Utopia. But what about the silent servers? What are their aspirations? What are their rights? What do they want? We don't know, and the writer doesn't care. It's only us, 500 years later, who look at the text and can even ask those questions because our world has changed.
Yes. Are there more questions? Else, maybe we could now wind up. Hemakshi, what do you think?
Yes, ma'am, we can wind up, but I think just before we start winding up, I just had an observation with Ravi's question is that I read a lot of, say, the new emerging sort of dystopian fiction that we talk a lot about right now. We have a lot of movies that come on it, we have a lot of books that come on it, and a lot of the characteristics of the world building in those stories is the fact that the idea that came forward because people wanted a utopia, and then it slowly turned into a dystopia, and then the revolution happens to it and create it into a utopia. And this is a theme that we see in a lot of science fiction, a lot of dystopian fiction, a lot of fantasy as well. So can you say that that is the sort of a very distinct characteristic of just emerging literature in general, the idea of this cycle of creating new utopias?
It's as old as literature itself. I don't think there's something particularly new about it. What happens with genre fiction is that a lot of it gets lost. But if you read, even in Gernsback's New Amazing Stories, there's a constant questioning of the world we are living in. Remember, this is a time between or after two world wars. First World War has happened, the second one is about to happen, but as a genre, it continues. past the Second World War. So imagining wars, questioning, is it possible to have an ethical war? Is it possible to have ethical rejection of wars? Is it possible to imagine a world where women have more rights? This is a constant theme. This is, from the time that one begins writing. I mean, like I mentioned, Plato's Republic, he has this idea of the ideal family and the ideal state. Perhaps it was ideal at that time. When I read it, I'm horrified at the way it seems to take away reproductive rights from both men and women. Estrange children from their parents, bring them up as wards of the state. We see what happened in Romania when that kind of idea was put into practice. So what's important, I think, is to keep looking at possible scenarios, which is what both philosophy and SF do, which is why I see them as connected, because there's a constant questioning of what is and what can be, and therefore at least looking at possibilities of change. Does that answer your question, or do you still have?
Yes, ma'am, it answers it.
Yeah.
Hey, Makshi, there's one question, and maybe that could be the last question.
Yes, ma'am, we'll take this as the last question. This question is by Aarti. Aren't people in Omelas kind of caged in the supposed happiness just as the child is caged in the suffering? So, could it be interpreted that the ones who walk away are walking away from both of these cages? Yes, ma'am. I think she's just elaborated on this idea, but that's the crux of her question.
Yes, but that's important, that you choose your suffering. And like I said, there are some critics who say that Omelas is a utopia because at least some people can choose to reject it. And that's, in one sense, Le Guin's point, that if things are enforced upon you, then that can never be a utopia.
Yes, ma'am. I think with that, we can end the session. On behalf of everyone present here, ma'am, I'm very thankful and we're very glad to have you here. It was personally, and I think everyone will agree, a very enriching and very great session. It's a story that stays with everyone whenever we read them, and to have such a in-depth analysis of it was great. Before we end the session and we leave, I would just like to ask anyone, the ones who can, to please switch on their video so we can have a courtesy screenshot.
And while we're doing that, for those, since many of you seem to have questions, I would suggest you Google the day before the revolution, which is a story written by Le Guin much after this one, which picks up the same themes. And you should look at a story called The Ones Who Stay and Fight, written by Jemison, who's a very popular current author writing in the field of SF. Which was written, I think, in January 2020, at the beginning of, when we knew we were entering a pandemic situation. And that is Jemison's response to The Ones Who Walk Away. And so though it's interesting to read both these authors looking at the aftermath of Le Guin's story, one from Le Guin herself and one from a very contemporary author, to understand that the story still exerts such power and influence over the genre.
Yes. And I think, somebody who talked about, whether it's science fiction or literature per se, I think the one thing that literature does is interrogate the present, the world.
Correct.
So I think that interrogation is what makes literature very powerful and also very scary, and which is why we see, the world sees writers and writing as such a, as such so dangerous. So I think that is the importance of literature. Are you done? So with that, thank you so much, Sanam, for
Yes,
this.
ma'am, I've taken the screenshots. So with that, again, and we hope, yeah, so we can end the session now. Thank you, ma'am.